Just before dawn, on the 6th of June, 1944, a German artillery officer stood in a bunker on a bluff in Normandy and put field glasses to his eyes. He was looking for weather. He found ships. Not a convoy, a fleet, from one edge of the horizon to the other. 250 miles east, the field marshal responsible for that coast was at home in Germany. It was his wife's birthday. 600 miles away, in the Bavarian Alps, the only man permitted to release Germany's armored reserve was asleep, and his staff would not wake him. How do you lose the decisive battle of the war before you fire a shot? Think of a fire company. Good men, drilled, standing at the wall. The hoses are in a locked cabinet, and one man has the key. He is not in the building. He believes the real fire is somewhere else, and he is still waiting for it. That is the German army in the West on the 6th of June. The officer on the bluff was Major Werner Pluskat, commanding a coastal artillery battalion above the stretch of sand the Americans had codenamed Omaha. Everything we know about that moment reaches us through one channel. In the 1950s, the journalist Cornelius Ryan interviewed hundreds of survivors on both sides for his book The Longest Day, and Pluskat was one of them. Ryan's reconstruction has Pluskat telephoning his superior to report the invasion, and being asked where exactly. Right in front of me. Treat that the way a historian would. It is testimony taken 15 years later, shaped by a writer building a scene. The words may not be the words, but the situation behind them is not in dispute, and it was repeated all along that coast in the same half hour. A garrison discovering, at close range and without warning, that the largest amphibious operation in history had already arrived. Below Pluskat's bluff, in a concrete and earth strongpoint the Germans catalogued as Widerstandsnest 62, was a private named Franz Gockel. He was 18 years old. He had been on that coast since the previous summer, pouring concrete, laying wire, driving stakes into the tidal flats. He had spent months building a wall for an invasion that everyone told him would land somewhere else. Gockel survived the day and spent the rest of his life describing it, in letters, in a memoir, in interviews with the BBC and with museums, and with the men who had come up the beach at him. He is the clearest, ground-level German voice we have from Omaha, and he is the voice this film will keep returning to. At about 5:30 in the morning, the naval bombardment began. For the men in the strongpoints, there was no fighting to do for the better part of an hour. There was only the arithmetic of shells and the question of whether the roof would hold. Then it stopped, and the smoke thinned, and they looked out at the water, and the water was full of small boats coming in. To understand why nobody came to help them, you have to go back a year, into an argument. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel commanded Army Group B, the forces holding the Channel coast. He had fought the British and Americans in North Africa, and he had learned the lesson that his colleagues in the East had not. That under total Allied air superiority, a German division cannot move in daylight. Not in strength, not on schedule, not without being taken apart from the air. So Rommel's conclusion was brutally simple. If the enemy could not be beaten in the water and on the sand in the first hours, he could not be beaten at all. Everything forward, guns, mines, obstacles, and above all, the tanks, close enough to the coast to intervene the same morning. His aide recorded him saying that the first 24 hours would be decisive, and that for both sides it would be the longest day. That recollection reached the world through Ryan, and it gave a book and a film their titles. Treat the phrasing as an aide's memory. Treat the conviction as certain, because Rommel spent his last spring rebuilding an entire coastline around it. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, his superior as Commander-in-Chief West, disagreed on the fundamentals. A landing could not be stopped everywhere. The coast was too long. Better to hold the armor back, inland, out of range of naval guns. Let the enemy come ashore and commit himself. Then strike him with a massed panzer force at a point of Germany's choosing. Two coherent doctrines, both defensible, both requiring the opposite deployment of the same tanks. The dispute went to Hitler, and Hitler did what he had been doing for 2 years. He split it. Rommel got some armor forward. Rundstedt got some armor back. And the strongest formations in the theater, the ones that could have changed the shape of the 6th of June, were designated OKW Reserve, High Command Reserve, releasable on Hitler's authority alone. The Cabinet and the Key. Neither field marshal could commit those divisions. Not Rommel, who believed the war in the West would be decided before lunch. Not Rundstedt, the most senior soldier in the theater, who thought the whole plan depended on a massed armored blow. They could request, they could not order, and the man with the key had come to a conclusion of his own about where the fire would be. Look at the channel, the way German intelligence looked at it in the spring of 1944, and the answer is obvious. The shortest crossing is the Strait of Dover, 21 miles. It lands you closest to the German border, closest to the Ruhr, closest to the ports and the launch sites for the V weapons. Any competent staff would go that way. The Allies knew the Germans thought this, so they built them an army that agreed with them. Operation Fortitude South was the largest military deception ever attempted. In southeast England, the Allies assembled the 1st United States Army Group, a formation that existed as radio traffic, as double agents reports, as inflatable tanks and plywood landing craft, as invented divisions with invented insignia and invented supply requirements. Its commander was General George Patton, the one Allied general the Germans genuinely feared, and therefore the one they would expect to lead the main effort. There was almost nothing there. On the German situation maps, there was a hammer poised over Calais. The consequence was the German 15th Army, strong, well-equipped, dug in on the Pas de Calais, waiting for a blow that was never coming. And when the real landings came, in Normandy, they were read exactly as the deception had trained the German command to read them. A diversion, a large one, designed to pull the reserves west so that the real invasion could come ashore in the east against an empty coast. Fortitude did not stop working on the 6th of June. That is the part that is hard to hold in the mind. The deception went on working for weeks after the enemy was ashore. 15th Army sat on its beaches through the critical phase of the Normandy campaign, guarding sand nobody was coming for, while the divisions in Normandy were fed into the fighting piecemeal and ground down. The best-placed reserve in the West spent the battle facing the wrong sea. Now the hours. Reports of Allied airborne landings reached German headquarters in Normandy shortly after midnight. Paratroops behind the coast at the base of the Cotentin around the Orne. By 2 in the morning, it was clear that something very large was happening. By 5:30, the naval bombardment was underway. At Army Group B headquarters, the Field Marshal's chair was empty. Rommel had left France on the 4th of June. The weather in the Channel was foul. The tide and moon tables suggested the Allies would not move for days. And he had two errands: to see Hitler about the Panzer question, and to be at home in Herrlingen for the 6th, which was his wife Lucy's birthday. The commander who had staked the defense of Western Europe on the first 24 hours was not in France when they began. He learned of the invasion by telephone in Germany, and spent most of the longest day in a car, arriving back in Normandy in the evening with the light already going. He was not the only empty chair. Several of the senior commanders in the sector were away or in transit. A map exercise in Rennes had drawn officers inland. That is not corruption or cowardice. It is what happens to an army that has been standing to for 18 months in bad weather. Alertness is a consumable. Theirs was nearly gone. And in Bavaria, at the Berghof, Adolf Hitler was asleep. Through the early morning, staff officers in France pressed for the release of the OKW Panzer Reserves, 12th SS Panzer, Panzer Lehr, the formations that could reach the coast in a day. Those requests went to High Command, and High Command did not release them. The chief of the operations staff, Alfred Jodl, declined to commit the reserves in the first hours, and no one woke the Führer to overrule him. The precise sequence of calls differs from source to source, and anyone who gives you a tidy transcript is guessing. What is not in doubt is the outcome. The release came in the afternoon, and by then those divisions had to move west in daylight under an air force that owned the sky. There is a version of this story where the delay is a single sleeping man, and it is a satisfying version. And it is too small. The delay was structural. Hitler had built a command system in which one signature from one location at one man's convenience unlocked the only force capable of a decisive counterstroke. Then he had persuaded himself that the fire in front of his men was not the real fire. The hoses were in the cabinet. The key was in Bavaria, in a pocket, in a house where nobody would knock.
None of this was visible from a Widerstandsnest. Allied planning for Omaha expected to face a static coastal division, thinly spread, of middling quality. What was actually holding that sector by June was reinforced by the 352nd Infantry Division, a field formation that had moved units closer to the coast and had put its artillery observers into the strongpoints on the bluff. It was better trained than the garrison troops, better integrated with its guns, and it had spent months registering every yard of that beach. Omaha was not a stronger position by accident. It was a stronger position because a competent division had been allowed to do the one thing German doctrine still permitted it to do: prepare, locally, in concrete, without asking anyone's permission. Understand what a strongpoint like WN62 actually is. It is not a fortress. It is a handful of concrete emplacements and trenches on a slope, sighted so that its machine guns fire not out to sea, but along the sand, in enfilade, so that the beach itself becomes the field of fire. The garrison is small, the ammunition is finite. There is no reserve behind it, because the reserve is 100 miles inland, waiting for a signature. Franz Gockel was at a machine gun in that position when the boats grounded. He described the bombardment first, the earth shaking, the position half buried, men praying. Then the sea, and how many ships there were, more than he could take in. Then the ramps going down, and hours of firing, and his weapon jamming, and being wounded in the hand, and being carried out of the line. He wrote home to his parents a few days later, on about the 10th of June, that the sea had been covered with ships, that the shelling had been beyond anything he could describe, that he had been wounded and was alive, and that they should not worry. 18 years old, defending a beach he had helped build, against an invasion his superiors had assured him would land 200 miles away. One more name from that position, Heinrich Zevalo, whose post-war account claims a personal casualty toll running into the thousands. Those figures cannot be verified and are not accepted by historians. What the evidence does support is narrower and heavier.
A small number of guns, well sighted, well supplied, for a few hours, did terrible damage to men wading through waist-deep water with no cover for 300 yards. Local tactical competence was never Germany's problem in Normandy. That is the uncomfortable finding. The men at the wall did their job.
One panzer division was close enough and free enough to strike on the 6th of June. The 21st Panzer Division, positioned around Caen and under the local chain of command, rather than locked in high command reserve. Its morning was spent in confusion because its orders changed. It was pointed at the airborne landings east of the Orne, then redirected west of the river toward the coast. Hours went into that reversal, and hours were the only currency that mattered. In the afternoon, it attacked north, and it got somewhere. Elements reached the coast in the gap between the British and Canadian beachheads, and for a short time there was a German armoured spearhead standing on the shoreline that Rommel's entire doctrine had been designed to defend. Then the arithmetic arrived. Naval gunfire from offshore, heavy enough to break up armour in the open. Fighter bombers overhead all day. The aircraft the German soldier called Jabos, which made every road a hazard and every daylight move a gamble. Anti-tank guns already ashore, and on the flank in the evening, a mass glider landing that told the German commanders reinforcement was arriving faster than they were. The spearhead pulled back. One division committed late against 5 beachheads and the guns of 2 navies. Even executed perfectly, it was not enough, and it was not executed perfectly. This is the point at which the whole German plan can be seen for what it had become. Rommel's doctrine required armour at the water's edge on day 1. Rundstedt's required a massed armoured fist inland. What actually happened was neither. A single division punching alone, and the fist arriving days later, in pieces, on roads under air attack. The men at the wall were fighting the fire. What came to help them was 1 bucket, and it came late. By the evening of the 6th of June, the Allies were ashore on 5 beaches. The lodgements were shallow, uneven, and in places not yet linked. Casualties on Omaha had been severe. The German coastal crust had held in some sectors for most of a day and had inflicted real losses. None of it mattered in the way the defenders needed it to matter. The enemy was on land, and once he was on land, the war in the West became a contest of build-up, and a contest of build-up against the United States and the British Empire had exactly one outcome. Rommel reached his headquarters that night. His 24 hours were already spent. He had said the first day would decide everything, and he had been right, and he had not been there. Go back to the man with the field glasses. He was not mistaken. He was not confused. He reported precisely what was in front of him. The largest fleet ever assembled, 3 hours off his coast. Below him, an 18-year-old in a concrete pit reported the same thing with a machine gun. The ships were real. The wall was real. The men on it fought the fire they could see for as long as their ammunition lasted. What was missing was a single mind that believed them, and the authority to answer. The hoses stayed in the cabinet. The key stayed in a pocket, 600 miles away, in the hand of a man who was still waiting for a fire at Calais that would never be lit, guarded by a phantom army on a map. The longest day
was longest for the soldiers who had no one left to call. Sources for this film include the National World War II Museum, the Imperial War Museums, the published testimony of Franz Gockel, and Cornelius Ryan's post-war interviews. Where accounts conflict, we have said so.